You don't think that child looks nothing like you? The question came quietly, almost casually, but it lingered in the air like something far heavier than it sounded. And Jack didn't answer right away, because he had heard variations of this before. Whispers, subtle comments, glances that lasted just a second too long. But this time it wasn't from strangers or distant relatives, it was from his own mother, and that made it impossible to ignore. He stood in the middle of the living room, his tie loosened after a long day, his mind still half occupied with work, but now completely pulled into something he didn't want to deal with, while his mother sat elegantly across from him, her posture straight, her expression composed, but her eyes sharp, observant, and unwavering. "What are you trying to say?" he asked finally, his voice calm but edged with warning. And she smiled slightly, not kindly, not warmly, but with a controlled patience that made everything worse. "I'm just saying, a mother knows," she replied, her fingers gently tapping the arm of the chair. "And something about this situation doesn't feel right." Jack exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, because he knew where this was going, and he didn't like it, not even a little. But before he could respond, the sound of small footsteps broke the tension, their son running into the room with a bright laugh, completely unaware of the storm building around him. And in that instant, everything else felt irrelevant. "Daddy!" the boy called, reaching up with both hands, and Jack immediately bent down, lifting him into his arms, holding him close, grounding himself in something real, something certain, something he didn't need to question. "Did you miss me?" he asked softly, and the boy nodded enthusiastically, wrapping his arms around Jack's neck, and for a moment, everything was simple again. But across the room, his mother was still watching, carefully, calculating. And that look didn't go away. Days passed, but her words didn't. They lingered in Jack's mind in ways he didn't expect, not because he believed them, but because they existed, and once a doubt is spoken out loud, it becomes harder to ignore, no matter how much you want to. Tử Tiên, on the other hand, noticed the change immediately, not in what Jack said, but in what he didn't say. The small pauses, the moments where his eyes lingered just a second longer on their son's face, the way he seemed to be thinking about something even when everything appeared normal. "What's wrong?" she asked one evening, standing in the kitchen while preparing dinner, her back slightly turned, but her attention completely on him, and Jack hesitated just for a second before shaking his head. "Nothing," he said. It was a lie, and she knew it. Meanwhile, his mother had already made her decision. If Jack wouldn't look for the truth, she would. It started quietly, without confrontation, without warning, because she knew exactly how to move without being noticed, how to control a situation without appearing to interfere. And within a few days, she had already arranged everything. A private clinic, a trusted doctor, no records that could be easily traced, no questions that would be asked out loud. All she needed was a sample. The opportunity came sooner than expected. One afternoon, while Tử Tiên was busy outside with their son, Jack's mother stepped into the child's room, her movements calm, controlled, as if she had every right to be there. And on the small table beside the bed, she found exactly what she needed: a used toothbrush. She paused for a moment, just long enough to steady her breath, because even for her, this wasn't a small step. But whatever hesitation existed, disappeared quickly. "This is for his future," she murmured softly to herself, slipping the toothbrush into her bag, and just like that, the line had been crossed. The next morning, she sat inside the clinic, her posture as composed as ever, the file placed neatly in front of her, her expression unreadable, because for her, this wasn't about emotion, it was about certainty, about protecting her son, about proving what she believed to be true. And when the doctor finally walked in, holding the results, she didn't look nervous, she didn't look afraid, she looked ready. "Mrs." the doctor began carefully, placing the envelope on the table. "The results are here." Her fingers moved slowly as she opened it, her eyes scanning the paper with precision, expecting confirmation, expecting validation, expecting to finally put an end to everything she had doubted from the beginning. But then, she stopped. Her expression changed, just slightly, but enough, because what she saw was not what she expected. And for the first time in a very long time, Jack's mother didn't know what to say. The paper didn't change no matter how many times she read it, and yet Jack's mother kept staring at it as if the words might rearrange themselves into something she could accept, something that aligned with what she had already decided was true, because certainty had always been her strength, and now, for the first time in years, that certainty was gone. The result was clear, clinical, undeniable, probability of paternity, 99.99%. And the numbers sat there like a quiet judgment, stripping away every suspicion she had built, every doubt she had allowed to grow, every silent accusation she had directed at Tu Tien without ever saying it out loud. Her fingers tightened slightly around the paper, not enough to wrinkle it, but enough to reveal the tension she refused to show on her face. And when the doctor spoke again, explaining something about accuracy and verification, she didn't respond. Didn't even look up because none of that mattered. Not anymore. What mattered was that she had been wrong. Outside the clinic, the world moved normally. Cars passed, people walked. Life continued as if nothing had shifted. But inside her, something had. Something small but significant. Something that forced her to confront a truth she hadn't prepared for. And for a moment, she just stood there, holding the envelope, her mind unusually quiet, because she didn't know how to carry this back home. Back to Jack, back to Tu Tien, back to the reality she had tried to control. At home, Tu Tien was sitting on the floor with her son, helping him stack small wooden blocks into a tower that kept falling apart no matter how carefully he placed them. And each time it collapsed, he laughed, not frustrated, not upset, just amused by the simplicity of trying again. And she smiled softly, brushing his hair back, her movements gentle, her presence calm, unaware of what had been done behind her back, unaware of the test, the doubt, the quiet betrayal that had already taken place. Jack stood nearby, watching them, but not fully present, because even now, the echo of his mother's words still lingered somewhere in his mind, faint but persistent, like something he didn't want to believe but couldn't completely ignore. And when Tu Tien looked up at him, their eyes met for a brief second before he looked away, and that was enough. She noticed. She always did. "You're still thinking about something?" she said quietly, not accusing, just observing, and Jack shook his head again, but this time his answer came slower. "It's nothing." She didn't push, but the distance was there. The door opened. Jack's mother stepped inside. Everything shifted. She stood there for a moment, her usual composure intact, her posture straight, her expression controlled, but something about her presence felt different. Not obvious, not dramatic, just altered, as if something had been removed that used to define her, and Jack noticed immediately. "You went out early," he said, watching her carefully. She nodded once. "Yes." Her gaze moved, from Jack to Tu Tien. Tu Tien stood slowly, her hand still resting lightly on her son's shoulder, her expression calm but guarded, because she knew, she had always known, that she was not fully accepted in this house, and every interaction carried that quiet weight, that unspoken tension. "Is something wrong?" she asked politely. Jack's mother didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked closer, each step measured, controlled, and then she stopped, right in front of Tu Tien. The room felt smaller, tighter. "I owe you an apology," she said. The words landed softly, but they hit harder than anything else. Jack froze. Tu Tien blinked, because neither of them had expected that. "For what?" Tu Tien asked, her voice steady but uncertain. Jack's mother held her gaze this time, not with judgment, not with suspicion, but with something unfamiliar. Acknowledgement. "I doubted you," she said simply, "and I acted on that doubt." Jack stepped forward slightly. "What do you mean?" She didn't look at him. Not yet. Her attention stayed on Tu Tien. "I arranged a DNA test," she said. Silence. Sharp. Immediate. Tu Tien's hand slowly dropped from her son's shoulder. Her expression didn't explode into anger, didn't break, but something in her eyes changed, because this wasn't just doubt. This was action. This was crossing a line. "You did that without telling us?" Jack's voice was low now, controlled, but there was tension underneath it. His mother finally turned to him. "Yes." No excuse, no defense. "And?" Jack asked, because now there was only one thing that mattered. She reached into her bag, pulled out the envelope, and handed it to him. Jack took it slowly, opened it, read it, and everything inside him settled. His shoulders dropped slightly, his breath eased, and when he looked up, his eyes moved directly to Tử Tiên. "I'm sorry," he said. The words came immediately this time, without hesitation, without distance. Tử Tiên didn't respond, not right away, because what had been broken wasn't small. Jack's mother spoke again, her voice quieter now. "The child is yours," she said. "There was never any doubt, only mine." And then, something unexpected happened. She lowered her head, not dramatically, not exaggerated, but enough to show what words couldn't. "I was wrong," she said. The room fell silent again, but this silence was different. Tử Tiên looked at her for a long moment, her emotions shifting between hurt, disbelief, and something else she couldn't quite define, because this wasn't just about being right or wrong, it was about trust, about respect, about the space she had tried so hard to hold in a place that had never fully accepted her. "You should have asked me," she said finally. Her voice was calm, but it carried weight. Jack's mother nodded slowly. "I should have." Another pause. Then, Tử Tiên looked at Jack, and this time, he didn't look away. Because now, there was no doubt left. Their son laughed again, knocking over his small tower of blocks, completely unaware of the storm that had just passed, and instinctively, both of them moved at the same time, reaching to help him rebuild it, their hands brushing lightly against each other. And this time, neither of them pulled away immediately, because something had shifted, something fragile but real. Not perfect, not fully healed, but different. Jack adjusted one of the blocks carefully, then looked at Tử Tiên again. "I won't let doubt come between us like that again," he said, and this time, it didn't sound like a promise, it sounded like understanding. Tử Tiên didn't answer with words, but she didn't turn away either. And sometimes, that was enough.